This is Make It Mentionable. I'm Alyssa Patmos, and this is the show about being human in a world that encourages us to be robots. I invite you to join me as we journey through the mess, the magic, and the mania in between, because what we can talk about, we can manage. This honest conversation extravaganza includes free-flowing conversations and high doses of vulnerability to remind you that you aren't alone. No topic is off limits, and episodes are designed to leave you smarter, aka more self-aware than when you came. I am so glad you're here. We are back at Make It Mentionable, and I am with my friend Colter Ray. I guess I should call you Dr. Colter Ray. You did work very hard for that.
It's all right. It's okay. Still call 911. I'm not a real doctor.
And Colter and I go way back to the days before I was a PhD dropout. And I do think we have to say, I think we have to like share the story of how we reconnected, because up until like last week, we hadn't talked or seen each other in 7 years.
Yeah. I was supposed to go to Denver to a show at Red Rocks with 3 other people. 2 of them are Canadian, and we're not able to travel into the States because of the quarantine rules upon returning to Canada. And then the other one, I was dating for a very long time, and then suddenly was not dating. And so a trip to Red Rocks just didn't make sense. So what ended up happening was I was going to not go. And then I was at the dog park here in Baton Rouge, where I live. And this woman said, "You have to go." And I said, "Okay, lady who I just met, I will take your advice." And she's like, "It's just, you have to do it." And I was like, "Okay." So I did that and started reaching out to people in Denver, and we reconnected.
Which was so fabulous. I'm so glad that this random lady in the park told you. Like, the synchronicity like that is so magical in life. I love it. But even before then, though, you didn't even know I was in Denver, because you texted me like the week before that you were hiding the album name of one of our an artist that we both love. You were hiding their album name in one of your latest manuscripts.
That's right. I forgot about that. That's right.
And so then we got on the train of like catching up. It'd been years, and I love the name of the album. So the artist that we both like is Nothing More, and the album name is The Stories We Tell Ourselves, right?
That's correct.
Which I think is so funny, because both of our work weaves in together the stories we tell ourselves. Like, I'm constantly rambling on about how success comes down to the stories you tell yourself and the stories you tell others. And your work is all about the dark side of social support.
Yeah. We like to think in general, like helping each other out is a good thing and it's useful. And I think the biggest misconception is that if you try, that's good enough. And in reality, you can find many ways to mess it up and be a bad supporter. And then on top of that, a lot of people just don't even bother at all. They just fade away, and they essentially ghost their friends whenever they need them the most.
Mm-hmm. So how did you get into what drew you to the dark side of social support?
And throughout my entire life, I've always found it really a useful, like, self-exercise to think about when learning anything, like what are the pitfalls to avoid as like a good first step. I tell the story frequently about in Little League when I was like 6 years old playing t-ball. I struck out. Like, there was a stationary ball on a tee in front of me, and I swung and missed it 3 times. And the reason why is because my coaches were telling me like 1,000 different things I was supposed to do correctly to swing a baseball bat. And I just overthought it. And anyone who's ever played golf would also know that exact same feeling. So the next time I went up to bat, as a little 6-year-old or 5-year-old kid, I was just like, I'm not going to miss the ball, right? That's the main pitfall to avoid, is don't miss the ball. And so that same idea translates to so many aspects of our lives, including how are we going to show up for our friends and family members whenever they go through something really terrible, like a cancer diagnosis. And there's some kind of obvious things that we can avoid as a starting point. And then from there, you can go on and learn, better techniques from there. But at the very beginning, like, don't miss the ball, right? At least hit the ball.
So So I guess we can dive right into some of those things, because I want to talk, I eventually want to talk about one of your latest projects, which I think will be a shock to some people, around when people choose not to give support. But first, when someone is making an attempt to support someone, and I know you look at it from the lens of cancer, but I'm also thinking about it in terms of things with mental health that we experience. Like that's another really common one right now, where people are uncomfortable. Like it can be really uncomfortable to know what to say when a friend drops on you like, oh my God, I'm really struggling with this. Or, hey, I have to let you know I was recently diagnosed with cancer. So what are some of the things that you found in your journey? Like, help us out. What can we do?
So you walked into a trap that you didn't even know you walked into, and that almost everyone else walks into as well. And that is, you phrased that question as, what can we say? And in reality, the further I get into this, which this is maybe slightly ironic as a communication professor, I realize being a good supporter is really not about what you say so much as your presence, and also how good of a listener you are. And that's really a common thing, even in my own classes and whenever I do other workshops for groups or nonprofits. People want to know, like, what is it that I say in order to help my friend, which is a very like noble approach, right? Like that makes sense, right? You want to be there for the person, you want to say the right thing. In reality, you should be focusing on, really, when it comes down to what do you say, it's, are you asking the right questions that will open up a space for you and that other person to share some presence together and for them to share their experiences. So let's dive into just a few of those like tools for the toolkit, right?
Yeah.
If you really don't know what to say, you're really got to buy some time here. Something that a lot of people just forget to do is to say, I'm so sorry this has happened to you, right? Like that's oftentimes unsaid, but it's sometimes really important that it is said. So you can say that just to begin. I'm so sorry that you're going through this. I'm so sorry this happened to you. But then let's pivot over to some questions you can ask. And they're going to sound like some of the questions maybe you've used whenever you have supported people, but there are some nuances to these that make them not completely, but different and better than what most people say. So the first one, and maybe my favorite, is how are you doing today? And the reason that I emphasize today is because that's the magic word. Because if you've ever watched someone go through a cancer journey or a tricky divorce or prolonged unemployment or whatever it is in their life, that's a multi-month, multi-year process, you know that there's ups and downs along the way. It's not, every day is not the worst day ever, but it's also not the best day ever every day either. So ask that person, how are you doing today? And they might say, look, in general, this has been a really rough go, but today's actually been a pretty good day. Or maybe it'll be the opposite. I'm really starting to turn a corner and process what I'm going through, but today's been really tough. Something happened. It just reminded me of, someone that I miss or something that's gone wrong in my life, and I'm just kind of down. So how are you feeling today is a great one. It opens up more space than just saying, how are you doing? Because people will just say, I'm fine, and they'll move on.
Right. I love the nuance there. Like I'm constantly talking about how nuance lights me up. And that's one of the things that I loved about studying communication too, is because it's that one simple word shifts the meaning entirely. It's like when we're at the grocery store and the cashier asks us, how are you doing? Like we don't answer honestly because we can tell that the other person doesn't really care. So It's switching up our social scripts, which I love. And I kind of love that I walked into this trap backwards because as a coach, listening is the most important thing as well. Like we can't, you're right. The impulse, our natural impulse is to come in and want to say more because it's uncomfortable to be in the silence. But the best thing we can do, and I experience this with coaching as well, is to be present and to allow our energy to go with where the other person needs us to be at the moment. And we can't possibly know what that is until we start listening. So I love that. I want to hear the other two questions, but I wanted to talk really briefly around what you said first, which is saying, I'm sorry that this is happening to you.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I can't be the only person who has felt this, but sometimes I feel awkward saying, I'm sorry this is happening to you. And I'm not entirely sure why. I'm sure there's a belief or something for me to unpack underneath that. But do you find that in your research? Like, do you feel like people sometimes hesitate to say, I'm sorry, or what's the response when that comes up?
I don't know if I have like an official, like empirically backed scientific answer to that. I think maybe, not to try to unpack your life or mine, because I sometimes feel awkward saying that too, is I think that maybe there's this this worry that saying that I'm sorry this has happened to you is almost like it's going to come across as pity for the person, when instead it should be coming across as like an opening to compassion and to empathy for that person. But I think there's, I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of trying to pick apart my own feelings about the times I've felt awkward saying that too. And maybe that's it. I'm not sure.
I like that. I think I can relate to that as well. So I don't think we have to necessarily pick it apart. I just wanted to touch on it because I know it's something that's come up for me in the past.
Yeah.
So the other things that segue into being great supporters in times of trouble.
Yeah, I'll give you one more. Another one is just, what has this been like for you? And you can kind of couch that within the context of how the conversation is going as well. You don't want to ever sound too robotic. Obviously, use your own natural voice and how you normally speak. But the reason why is, especially when you're looking at this through the cancer context, is that so many cancer patients experience their loved ones and supporters just assuming that their experiences are substantially similar to other cancer patients' experiences, just because they hear that the person's going through chemo. They assume that all chemo is the same, whenever that is not the case at all. Or they hear that they're going to have a radiation therapy, and they assume, well, if my father had radiation therapy, then I guess I know what that must be like for you then, what you're going through. And that's not the case. There's differing degrees of intensity for these things, different lengths of treatment. Even if two people have the same cancer diagnosis, even if something really specific and maybe not a common cancer, those prognoses can be so drastically different for those two people. You just don't want to make the assumption that because you think you know what's happening, that you do. And so instead, ask, what has this been like for you specifically? Like, what has your experience been with this? And you can even couch that within, like, well, I've known other people who've had, similar courses of treatment or the same type of cancer, but what has your experience been like? And people going through that are going to love that question, because they so rarely get the opportunity to like have the floor and to really be like, oh, yes, I can finally share my unique shitty experience with cancer. And it's not that, like, there's no assumption that people are making about what I'm going through. I can finally just lay bare what my experience has been, what my emotions have been, what my physical reaction has been to these treatments, and really tell my story, to bring it back to the narratives that we talked about earlier. That's a question that opens up a space for a narrative to be shared.
That's beautiful. And I think that's a great question to have in our toolkits across the board as a human. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. I think, if you really back it out, it just one step back to just all illnesses, or like 3 steps back to just the human experience in general in life's various traumas and tragedies. Like, yeah, you probably shouldn't assume that you know what someone's going through, just in general. Like, you just have no idea who is going through a divorce, or who's lost a child, or who's going through what. Even if they look happy and like they're getting their work done, don't make those assumptions, and don't assume that their experience is the same as other people who've gone through the same thing.
I know I've experienced this from the perspective of having OCD, where, sometimes the popular shows come out. Like, I think there was one called Monk for a while, and it frames OCD in the light of constantly having things be placed in perfect symmetrical order, which is one faction of it, but it's not what many people with it experience. And so people, I think people oftentimes they want to relate because we feel like that's the most compassionate thing we can do. But what I'm hearing is sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is listen and allow the other person the chance to truly speak and be seen in that way.
Yeah, well, something I found just through interviewing many cancer patients throughout my career is this really interesting phenomenon where like this polar tension occurs sometimes relatively quick within sentences of each other, where a cancer patient conveys first that they just wish their family and friends would treat them, I'm going to put this in quotes, but like normal. I wish they would just treat me like normal, like my pre-cancer self. And then sentences later, they say something to the effect of, well, at the same time, like I have cancer and that makes me a special case in many ways. And like, there's some special treatment or unique things that I need from the people in my life. And so I think that there's this tension between treat me normal at times, but at other times, it is going to be drastically obvious that I have special needs or things that I need in my life because I'm battling cancer. So that's an interesting thing to deal with. And on the supporter side of things, it could create this dilemma of like, what do I do? Do I avoid the topic and treat them, quote, like normal? Or do I dive into the topic and perhaps put them into a kind of sad, depressed mood because I'm bringing up the C word again? And the answer, honestly, is if you're really a good supporter, you're going to be showing up more than once. You'll be showing up multiple times, hopefully pretty consistently in that person's life to support them through their cancer journey. So you'll have opportunities to do both. You'll have opportunities to say, like, let's just quit working and go drink and play miniature golf. And, as I don't know where that came from. I think that's what I want to do right now after I'm done working today. But, and there's other times where it's like, hey, let's have that deep life conversation about your greatest fears and uncertainties and what's next. But if you only show up once or not at all, then you won't have the opportunity to address potentially both sides of that coin.
Right. If we're showing up once, we're putting all the pressure on that one conversation. We have to meet all the needs in this one conversation, which that's a lot of pressure versus right. if we're showing up numerous times and allowing ourselves as supporters the grace and compassion of knowing, okay, we're going to show up multiple times, then it takes the pressure off that one conversation for it to be perfect.
Right.
So with this though, because one thing I am abundantly aware of, especially as a coach, is we are not taught to listen well. And that is something like listening is a skill. And, both of us have taught COM 101, and that is much of what we go over is how to listen. And so what are some tips that you have for people there then? Because when you're saying show up with presence, I find that a lot of people, they're so in their own stuff, they don't actually know how to do that, and to then not just give lip service to the question, but truly follow that through with listening.
Yeah. There's a handful of things that come to mind right away. We'll start with the basics. Shut up. Like actually Great. Stop talking, which is easier said than done. I know I'm actually pretty bad at this. I get so excited to contribute back to the conversation, probably as a way of like building rapport and like demonstrating that I'm involved and interested, that I have found myself sometimes interrupting the person and cutting them off because I want to add in my 2 cents to the conversation. And so I have to consciously remind myself to do that. And if you struggle with that too, then feel fine about that, because people who have their communication PhD also make the same mistake. So the first thing is just shut up, stop talking, and make the conscious decision to actually listen. And so that means put your phone away. Like, don't even have it out. There's been some research done that has shown just the presence of cell phones like on the table during a conversation restricted the breadth and depth of the conversation. So fewer topics were discussed, and those topics were not discussed as in depth compared to whenever cell phones were not present. So put any distractions away, whether it's a cell phone or whatever else is going on in your life, and really zone in and listen to this person. As you do that, Another common thing that people experience is what we would call listener apprehension. So maybe you've heard of like speaking apprehension or communication apprehension, like the fear of public speaking. There's also a listening side to that. And it plays out like this. I used to experience this all the time at my first job in the corporate world before I went back to grad school. And my office is right next to the president of the company. And he would sometimes just yell my name. I'm running in there and he'd start telling me all these things I needed to do. And about 3 seconds into that list, I'd be like, oh shit, I already forgot one of those things. And as I'm thinking, oh shit, I already forgot one of those things, now I've lost like the next 2 things I was supposed to do. And now I've just completely switched from listening to thinking, oh God, I'm being a bad listener. What did he just say? I already forgot. I'm up the creek now. And the same thing happens a lot of times whenever someone's dumping something really emotionally heavy on you, like they're going through a divorce or they have been diagnosed with cancer. The reaction, rightfully so, is like, oh God, I want to be there for this person. Like, what do I do? What do I say? And as you've had that train of thought, you've already maybe missed out on some really important information that they're telling you that could help you be a better supporter. So really zone in, try not to think about your fears of what you're going to say. That can come later. And then the last thing is when they're done speaking or when you think they're done speaking, just wait, sit there in silence for another 3 seconds. That's an amazing thing. And it's going to feel like an eternity. Like that 3 seconds is going to feel like a whole Lord of the Rings movie length of time. And so, but the reason why is because it can give you a moment to process what you've just heard. It also leaves the door open for them to add something more to what they've already told you. Because sometimes people, as they tell you things, are unsure if they want to lay everything on you all at once. And so if you give them a little bit of silence and a little bit of a breath to think, you'd be surprised how often they decide to say something else that maybe they weren't sure if they were going to share in the first place. So to recap, shut up. Don't get freaked out if you don't know what to say. Instead, focus that energy on the other person. And then whenever you think they're done speaking, just chill for like 3 seconds and really see if there's anything else that they want to add.
The 3-second thing is huge. I've had to practice that. I've even had to practice that in my personal relationships where any sort of conflict comes up, because so often the natural inclination is to jump right back in. And if the cadence of a conversation has been going one way, then you might think that person's done. But if they just paused for a second and they weren't, then you jumping in right away doesn't help anything. And then they might think that you're interrupting them. It can cause a whole host of things in conflict. But then also I've found that sometimes I think I think faster. And so I want to respond. And it's not that I wasn't actively listening. I just was like really excited and something came to me instantly, but it doesn't give the other person a chance to feel like you fully absorbed it. And part of a conversation is, how does it feel for both people? Because whatever that then triggers in them is going to remind them of another conversation they've had, which is going to end up subconsciously influencing it. So the 3 second tip is glorious across the board as well.
Yeah, and it works. It's really just a good habit, just in general. Like, again, kind of maybe one of the themes so far of this conversation is so much of like powerful communication or like good or competent communication is not what you say. It's kind of everything else surrounding it. It's how good of a listener are you, being okay with silence, and those things are really useful. And same thing if you're in a business meeting or if you are in conflict with a sibling or a parent or a loved one, silence can be a good thing. It can convey that you are really absorbing and thinking through, and you're not just saying something to fill the silence. You're really being more cognizant.
Silence is powerful. It can also be a way to really demonstrate presence, because sometimes presence is sitting in it. And the reality of, a cancer diagnosis is they're sitting in it. They have no other choice. And so sometimes us being willing to sit in it with them, I'm imagining that the silence can be super powerful as well.
I'll never forget a conversation I had, and this was just with one of my best friends. It's actually probably the longest continuous relation or a friendship I've ever had in my life. So shout out to Kristen McGuire. Good job, Kristen. And pre-happy birthday to her. But there was one time we were driving somewhere together. It was like a 2-3 hour drive, probably between like Houston and Austin or something like that. We've known each other so long. We just went like 20 or 30 minutes without saying anything to each other. And there was no awkwardness about that. And it's just something beautiful about that. And then I think I broke the silence by, of course, saying like, isn't it cool that we can just like sit here in silence together, thus ruining the silence. But, it's one of those things that is, I don't know. I mean, to you or to all the listeners out there, like how many people in your life are you completely comfortable being around in silence for an extended period of time? Like, and there might not be many.
I love using that as an exercise with people, because if you task someone with intentionally sitting around someone and trying to be silent, you will see so many of your insecurities come up. Like if you're not truly comfortable with that person, like some thoughts are going to fly through your head. And those are very fun things to dive into and to start making aware within yourself, because it's the subtext of all of our conversations that really impact the result. Like you said, even more so than our words sometimes. Yeah. And the cumulative effect of our actions over time. And so that brings me to like really some of the dark side of what we're talking about. And you recently did a study where you were looking at what happens when people don't want to give support. And in our society, it's largely expected that we give support if someone is going through something. So can you dive into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was, I have the coolest job in the world. I get to sit around and think about things that are perplexing to myself and to other people. And then I try to figure out why that is and what's happening. And so a conversation I had with a friend who's in the doctoral program with me, I think it was on my second year, we were debating for whatever reason, if you were a cancer patient and going through cancer, what would be worse, whether someone tried to be supportive and said the wrong thing, or if that person who you thought would be there for you just never showed up at all. So we devised an experiment to actually see, and it turned out they were equally as terrible, like just quantitatively, like almost identically as bad, which goes back to my baseball analogy of like, at least swing the bat and try to hit the ball, right? If you strike out swinging, that's an out. But if you just sit there with the bat on the shoulder and you never even swing it, that's just as bad. You'll still strike out. And so we found that those were equally as bad. That kind of morphed into a follow-up study of like, okay, why is it that people avoid reaching out to someone they know with cancer, thinking it was going to be straightforward answers? So like, probably the best way to convey what we found was to tell the story of looking at that data for the first time. We had maybe 600 people or 600 reasons for not supporting someone with cancer. These are from people who'd actually made that decision. So I opened up this data set. It's just, a really big spreadsheet, essentially. I'm like, all right, first response. I don't know what to say. And even if I did know what to say, I wouldn't know how to say it. I'm like, okay, that was expected. There's going to be a lot of people who are like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Second response. It's just kind of outside of the norms of our relationship. We mostly just talk about sports and other superficial things at the water cooler at our office. For me to ask her about her cancer would be like really too weird and not normal for us. Third response. My mother is a bitch. She left me when I was a teenager for her boyfriend. And just because she has terminal cancer doesn't mean I have to suddenly love her. I remember reading that and just like pushing back in my chair.
Wow.
And just thinking like, that is insane. So unexpected, super intriguing, and surely a one-off that will not come up again. And it turned out of those 599, 600 reasons, however many we had, it accounted, something along those lines accounted for 10% of the reasons, roughly 10%. So it was a pretty common human experience, was I didn't support this person who I knew with cancer because they don't deserve my support. They've hurt me in the past, or they've treated other people really poorly in the past, or they've brought it upon themselves through their own decisions and actions. Fascinating and so unexpected. And so, of course, that led to one more recent study that's being peer reviewed right now, which was a series of interviews that look at the narratives or the stories that we tell ourselves that are surrounding that decision to not support someone who's going through something difficult, not necessarily just cancer, but maybe a divorce or depression or things like that. And it was really interesting to see the different narratives and stories that people created, the ways that they framed themselves within those stories and how they framed the other person and the patterns that arose between the interplay of those two characters that were being developed as these people told their narratives. It was really fascinating.
Well, and so much of life is our relationships. It's how we come to understand ourselves. It's how we relate to the people around us. And so it doesn't surprise me, but it goes against everything we're taught to do from a proper social standpoint. And so one of the things that I love that you did in the study is categorize some of these narratives that people put on themselves and categorizing them into, you did self-identities for themselves, like what they were telling themselves about themselves. And then you also did the stories that they were making up or the stories that they were telling about the person who they thought didn't deserve support. Did I get that right?
Yes. Yeah. So essentially, when you are making up your story or telling your story, you cast yourself in one light, but you also are creating a character or a persona or however you want to, or a narrative about the other person as well. Like there's multiple characters in a story. So how do those develop and how do they affect each other?
So are you willing to talk about, you had four, I think you had four or five self-identities that people came up with around themselves. Can we go into those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Maybe the best way to approach this, or what I think would be the most interesting way, is to like just go ahead and tie it in and look at the most common patterns that we saw between like the self and other identities. So we saw quite frequently people casting themselves as these burdened givers or these obligated victims, and that was most frequently as a response to casting the other person who was going through cancer or whatever as an egotist. So someone who was habitually almost narcissistic throughout their lives, who were so self-centered and self-focused that whenever something like cancer struck, these people realized that they felt burdened and obligated to help these people to the point where they were starting to feel like they were victims themselves. And so what that leads up to is eventually a breaking point where it's like, I just can't do anymore for this person, or this person has been so self-focused their entire life that I'll still support them because they're my father or they're my brother or my cousin, but I really just feel obligated. I'm doing it out of obligation. Now I feel victimized or I feel burdened. The process of being a supporter is not a joyous one. It's just a burden. So that was a really common pattern that we saw.
So I'm curious because there's a way where that's painted as a bad thing and these people are judged. But I'm sure there are some people listening where it's like, no, this is real life and I'm identifying as one of those. And it is what it is. But then there's a lot of shame that comes with that because they know they're going against social norms. They know they're making a choice to not do this. So have you found anything about what emotions are they battling when they make this decision?
Yeah, that's actually something else that we started to, or that we did ask about when we did these interviews. And to be honest, we just haven't really delved into that yet. And that's just because this is such fresh data. I mean, it's really, like I said, it's not even officially published yet. But obviously, those are some of that's part of the battle, right? And I think that informs pretty strongly informs the different characters or personas that, or the identities, I guess I should say, that people are forming for themselves, right? So whenever someone says, why didn't you continue helping your father, or why didn't you continue helping this person? You can say, look, I became the victim in this situation. I was being, really taken advantage of, and the person doesn't really, at the end of the day, they're not doing enough for themselves, or they are too self-focused, or they have done terrible things in the past. And even though it goes against norms, I'm not going to support them.
So what would you say to people then about two people who either know they're struggling or those of us where potential struggle might be in the future and we need social support, which happens to all of us at some point or another. So how do we need to reset our expectations for who's going to be there, who we can rely on? Like, how do we reset expectations of what is reasonable to expect from other people?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of, I don't know. And I again, this is a hunch, but I feel like there are actually just maybe two different types of people, or maybe there's a continuum when it comes to people going through difficult situations. There tends to be a difference, at least I've noticed, in the amount that people engage in what I call scorekeeping, which is, I know some people in my life who, whenever they lost a parent or went through something terrible, it's like they had a mental spreadsheet of like, who actually reached out? What did they do? Was it actually helpful? Who didn't reach out? Is that person my friend, or am I going to chastise that person, or how upset am I? And other people are just kind of like, well, if they didn't reach out, I'm sure they were busy, no big deal. And even this person who brought me over this disgusting pineapple pizza, I'm not going to eat that, but like, it was nice of them to do that. And they seem to be, I don't know, not as judgmental about the support they receive. And it's even a thing I've done with my students as well, is this exercise. And it's of just kind of seeing what people think about different offers of support. And some people are really cool with just anything. And other people are like, oh, that's kind of a burden or kind of a pain in the ass, or like, I would never eat that, or, so, so I think that might be one part of it. I think another part of it is, and maybe the story or the lesson learned from this most recent study is that, like, if you were an asshole all your life, what goes around comes around, right? Yeah. And so I think one day I'm going to write a book called Assholes with Cancer. And it's just going to be maybe based initially on some of the interviews from this study, but it's going to focus on whenever bad things happen to terrible people. And how do we deal with that? If that terrible person happens to have been your mother or your father or a boss or an ex or whoever it might be, because there's this narrative in society that you should support those people. But what if they abandoned you or abused you or something terrible? Like, how does that play out? So what goes around comes around is definitely something that we have found in this research. And that goes against some of the prior research, which is typically, reciprocity norms. If, for family members, we have such a long drawn out relationship that we will eventually, support each other in both ways. And it would be like a two-way street because we have that lengthy relationship to do so. Maybe not, if you've been terrible for like a decade or 50 years, don't be surprised if your kids don't support you at the end of your life, whenever you have terminal cancer. As harsh as it is, like, that just might be the reality.
And I imagine the concept of boundaries comes up in social support research a lot, because I could envision where someone goes through the turmoil of making the decision, hey, mom or dad, I'm not actually going to support you in this. And then at that point, they almost have two choices, where it's like they ghost, sort of like you mentioned earlier, where it's, I'm going to pretend this isn't happening. I'm ignoring all things, not showing up for you. Or there's a conversation, and that conversation could be very haphazard and very blame oriented, or it could be filled with boundaries. So have you found anything, or is there a large body of research around boundaries in social support as well?
Yes. There's just a large body of research around boundaries and communication in general.
Right.
And some of that would look at social support instances. I think that, well, from these interviews that we did most recently, we found that there was mostly pretty hard boundaries being set, in the sense of what that boundary looked like is, no, I'm not going to support you. And sometimes people would have the conversations, why, with the person, but more often than not, they wouldn't. They would just choose not to. And I think about how that's really a conscious choice that people make. It's not a haphazardly done decision. I'm thinking of one participant who They and their sibling had a parent who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer diagnosis. And their first, to give you an idea of the status of the relationship, their first conversation with each other was, is this person even telling the truth? Or is this just a ploy to try to get us to get back into their life? And so once they realized that it was likely actually the truth that this person had this terminal diagnosis, the two of them sitting down and talking and making the conscious decision that no, they were not going to reconnect. They were not going to support their parent as they died from this disease, which is just, it seems harsh until you find out the other side of the story, which is that parent was emotionally abusive to those kids and all the way into adulthood. And it's just, it's sad, but the reality is again, if you have been terrible to people, there's two parts of reciprocity, right? If you're nice to people, people will be nice back to you. But if you're not, don't expect the world whenever, things go awry.
Yeah. And it sounded like those siblings were then providing social support for each other to be able to have to determine what they were going to do. I think I asked the question because it would seem like if you consciously set the boundary and maybe even have a conversation about it, obviously if it's not a dangerous situation or it's not something like that where reconnecting in any way starts to open a channel. But I'm wondering if people who are willing to have the conversation, I'm wondering if it negates some of the shame in a different way. I'm wondering if it takes away some of like the judgment or how that might shape the story that they tell about themselves.
What do you think?
I think that, this show is called Make It Mentionable. And to me, that is when we can mention stuff, we can manage it. And so it doesn't mean that it always has to be a conversation to that person directly, but I do think that when we are able to look at things consciously and know like, okay, I've made a choice. And then sometimes when we do have to share that choice to be able to fully allow ourselves into it. And I think sometimes I do think there's a world where some of the shame could dissipate if there's a boundary set and the conversation is had, because then it's clear and there's less guilt. There's not this like, I'm constantly wondering what they're thinking. Like, am I a bad daughter? Like, there's so many stories that come into play when we are at the point where we have to make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. I think that would mitigate, at least for the person who might withhold support or not give support. If you are at least setting those boundaries, I think it does kind of help out. Maybe with the guilt part, I think I really would agree with that for their own internal feelings of guilt. But you also brought up something interesting too, which was like the safety issue. And so there's some great research on ghosting I need to just ask her how to say her last name because I'm never sure if I get it right. It's I believe it's Leah Lefevre at Alabama, I believe. And she looks at the different reasons why people ghost and things like that. And, we tend to think of ghosting as something that's happening in a dating context. Like, they stop talking to you altogether. But one of the reasons people ghost sometimes is out of safety. Like they just have to immediately and forever cut off all communication because they're worried if they try to break up with someone in person, they might experience physical danger. And I think that a lot of that applies here in this situation of like ghosting your friend or family member or whoever with cancer, but it's more of a psychological danger that you're avoiding, right? Like, why would I even have a conversation with someone who has been emotionally abusive? Because the only thing that could happen to it potentially is it would reopen those psychological wounds, and it might be the safer play for my own mental health to ghost and to just completely avoid that conversation altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's ultimately, I think the most important thing, the reason why I love this study and exposing this to begin with is because this is real life. These are the things people are dealing with, and by talking about it, even in this context, and releasing research around it, it becomes more normalized, and people don't feel like they have to hide in this very painful situation. I mean, I don't think any of your participants are ridiculously cavalier around making this choice. Like pain has led up to it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't
No,
expect.
Yeah, I think although this would be an interesting follow-up study, is to interview people who did not receive support that they expected to receive, and to see what would count as a good reason in their eyes, like for someone not reaching out. And that again could differ based on kind of if a person's a scorekeeper or not. One thing I think that's worth mentioning while we're talking about this study is probably the second most common pattern that we saw of identity was a lot of times people would portray the person that they're not supporting as a lost cause or as a do nothing. So this person, whether they're going through cancer or divorce or whatever the other stressor is in their life, they're just not doing enough to help themselves, or they're not taking the advice or the support that they're receiving and using it. So they're stuck in like a cyclical pattern of destructive behaviors, right? And so we saw this frequently with people who had like drug issues. And at what point do you give up and just say, I just can't support you anymore, right? Like I just, you're not doing anything, or you're not doing enough to help yourselves. And so what ends up happening is we saw this pattern where if the person is painted as a lost cause or as a do nothing, the narrator, the person who did not provide support, they tend to identify or create this identity of being the defeated helper. So and this is important because it showed that they tried, they did their best. Sometimes they went longer in trying to support than they wanted to, but eventually they just had to concede defeat and say, look, this person is a lost cause. They're not doing enough for themselves. Nothing that I can do or that I have done has helped. I give up. I'm out. And I did. And that's important too, with like the shame and guilt aspect, right? Mm-hmm. I think that identity inherently combats those things, because if someone's like, why are you no longer supporting your son who has a drug addiction? I supported that guy or that kid for 5 years and tried to put him through various rehabs and all the late night phone calls and all this stuff. And it's just, I've just hit a point where there's nothing I can do and I give up. And that's, again, as with most of the research I do, a very heavy and sad thing to encounter. But it's the reality of it, is that people have a breaking point and they just have to sometimes concede defeat.
Well, and yeah, I imagine that some of those people probably identify as a savior for a long time, where it's like they were helpers. They're like, I want to save you from this. And they put themselves out there in that way. But there also becomes a point where, that person who's constantly trying to help, constantly trying to save, like they have their own wounds. They have their own struggles that are putting them in this position, trying to get needs met by trying to save other people. And so there does come a point where for their own safety, they have to, or safety, sanity and safety in some cases, then they have to make that decision too. And so it's so like, this is why communication is fascinating, because it is so nuanced. Our reality is constructed based on these stories that we're choosing to tell ourselves. And if we're going to keep that narrative going, I think that's what you mentioned, that in the study, one of your co-authors, it looks like she studies narratives, and she talked about one of the important things being not just what the story is, but how long someone's able to keep the story going and that narrative going on.
Yeah, it's the quote that she provided from, first off, shout out to Christina Sharp at University of Washington. She is an excellent interpersonal researcher and a joy to collaborate with. And that was one of my main partners in crime on this study. And she quoted another researcher, I can't remember who it was off the top of my head, but essentially, yeah, your identity is not necessarily in the narrative, but to the extent that you can sustain that narrative. Oh, that's a real mind-blowing thing to think about when you're laying in bed at night, is you can already go down that rabbit hole of like, what is this identity that I try to construct for myself on a daily basis? And how do I want other people to see me? Then you add in, what are all the things I'm doing to sustain that and to like keep that story going? And it's like, oh man, you can go deep and dark real quick. And I'm sure like there's some good that comes out of that, but that would also almost be like a great, that'd almost be just a great counseling session for anyone and everyone should go see counselors, I think. But I think just to talk about what are the stories that we create for ourselves and what are the behaviors, for better or for worse, that we engage in to keep those narratives going.
That is like the crux of my work. And one of the things I have people do many times in exercise I give is writing the story of their life out, how they've told it for years, and then giving them the task of, okay, now I want you to tell these same events, but I want you to write it in a completely different way. Because that's the thing, like we can tell ourselves 50 different stories about the exact same event. And I think that's interesting in the context of social support too, because one thing I wanted to ask you about. So when I was in my early 20s, the guy I was dating at the time, his dad, someone that you and I both know of, his dad was diagnosed with cancer, and he was supposed to pass away within 3 weeks, but he ended up living for 15 months. And so when the family grieves initially from the shock of, oh my God, he could be gone in 3 to 9 weeks, but then the support ends up going on for 15 months and you don't know what's going to happen. There's this interesting dynamic that I saw where so many times it's about the person with cancer, but the family was going through so much too, and they were exhausted, and it was like preparing every last meal as if it was his last meal because you just didn't know. And what I saw was so many people focusing on just the person with cancer and not knowing at all what to do or how to be respectful of the family. It was almost like, they would get calls and it's like, hey, neighborhood, can I stop by and say hi to him? And it's like, we have a life. I'm exhausted. We just had 3 people over. So what do you see in the context of, and I feel like this falls into the dark side because family members can feel like crap acknowledging these things. So what do you see in the context of this? Like what needs to be made mentionable around how to support families and the people closest to cancer patients as well?
Awesome question. There's not nearly enough research at looking at how to support the supporters. Some people have looked at that even in recent years. Elena Voluschek is a researcher who's done that. But I think at the end of the day, people who are like not the center of attention. So let's say like not the cancer patient, but like that cancer patient's spouse or parents or kids, they're almost the center. They're like the next ring out essentially. And those people need a lot of support, like a lot. And it's just not typically thought of. It's kind of, or if it is thought of, it's usually like a secondary thought, right? After we do something for the person who's about to pass away, let's also like do something for the kids or whoever is closest. And the thing that I think is like most important and probably most practical to think about is there's these different layers of like how close you are to being the person who is going to die of cancer or who has cancer. And the closer you are to the middle, the more rights you have. So if you are the person with cancer or like an immediate family member, you get control of that situation and you can tell people like, no, you're not coming by today. We're too exhausted. We just have other things that we have to do some self-care first. Mm-hmm. And if you're not one of those people, you're kind of more peripheral. You have to realize you don't have as many rights in this situation. Mm-hmm. And yes, maybe this is someone who you've known a long time and worked with for 15 or 20 years, who's maybe going to pass away in the next 9 weeks. But you have to be respectful of the fact that that's someone's spouse or that's someone's father. And those people do get a little bit of priority. And so if they tell you no, this is not a good time, you can't really get angry with them, right? Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, you should be supporting kind of all the layers that are closer in than where you are. not just the person at the very center. So there's been some research that kind of looks at that. There was a great article published years ago in the Los Angeles Times by, I believe, someone in the nursing profession. And it was essentially something along the lines of like a ring theory of support, which in many ways is pretty similar to what I just described. But the first step is just realizing the supporters need support as well.
Supporters need support. And then the concept of, when you're closer, they're more right.
And self-care as well, right? And so like, as the world reopens here and we all a lot of us start traveling again, and we're hopping on flights and going to wild and crazy places like Denver, Colorado, or wherever. We maybe have flown enough that we don't really consciously hear this anymore. But whenever you get on a flight, the flight attendants say, in the case of losing cabin pressure, make sure you put on your own oxygen mask before you put on someone else's. And that's kind of almost been a cliche in like the psychological like literature, like, help yourself first before you help someone else. But what people don't realize is if your plane actually lost pressure, the reason why they tell you that is because you have about like 3 seconds, if you're a normal, healthy person, before you will black out. And so it's not like, it's not this weird, like, don't help your kid with their mask, help yourself first. It's like, there's a real reason for that. It's because you have such a limited amount of time before you are completely incapacitated.
You're physically not going to be able to help them unless you did it. Yeah.
So you got to really prioritize self-care. Like imagine that you're in a plane that just went, no longer is pressurized. You got 3 seconds, right? So that's how quickly you should be aware of whenever things in your life depressurize and your life starts to fall apart. You really got to take care of yourself first, or else you're just going to be not useless, but you're not going to be at your best to help the other people.
And that's where that's interesting and so important, because in that situation I saw how hard it was for them to take the time for self-care. And fortunately I was in a position at that time where I had known the family for it was 4 years at that time. I was very close to them. And so I could give them the gift of time to then go do that. And so that, I think that's one way that people can support the supporters that we often forget about, is like, I don't need you to cook me another meal. I just need you to sit here with him so that I can go do what I need to do, defined by me. Yeah. And it can be hard, especially for the people, who identify more as saviors to do those things. The one other thing I wanted to add on to this is when the grief period comes about, because that's when it almost reverses. It's like people rush in because they want, they want to be able to have a clean relationship with that person when that person goes, especially if it's a terminal case, which not all cancer diagnoses are, thank goodness. But when the grief period does come around, then it's almost like it flips and all the focus is on the family. And then there's a lot of judgment. I don't know if you've experienced this, but in my experience, there was a ton of judgment then on the family for how they were grieving and how quickly they were grieving. And people had forgotten that they thought he was going to pass away in 9 weeks. Yeah. And it ended up being so long. And so there's so much judgment that goes around like this concept of social support. Have you encountered anything like this?
Not in the research circles, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I will never claim to know every single thing in my own area. But it's not as far as I know, a very common thing that people look at, that specific like judgmental actions during the grieving process. But it absolutely happens for sure, right? I think another thing or another context you see that in is like with relationships ending. And it's like, that person was in a relationship for 4 years and like a month later they're, on a date with someone. And it's like, how could they do that? And it's like, well, what you don't know is like, maybe they were in an abusive relationship and they've been mentally checked out and emotionally checked out of it for like a year. And they've already gone through the grieving process and they finally felt safe enough or confident enough to leave that relationship. And they've already done a lot of the grieving, right? Like that was something that happened just while the relationship was still going, in the same sense that with the person that you were mentioning is, if they were expecting that person to live for somewhere like 21 days to 2 months, there's maybe a really accelerated grieving process to some extent that's happening. And then whenever that gets drawn out and that person lives for over a year, when that day comes and the person passes away, they've maybe already grieved at a much different pace and in a different way than someone who loses a parent suddenly to a stroke.
Right. Oh, very, very different experiences there. So I want to first thank you for being here. And I want to summarize, because some of the things in the beginning, the toolkit, the conversational phrase toolkit, let's recap those. So what are the things we need to have in our back pocket? There's the 3-second pause and the gift of,
let's kind of divide them up into listening and then some questions that you can ask to open up space. To provide just a little extra structure for our listeners.
Make it even easier. I love it. So let's start with listening.
Yeah. Okay. Listening. Make the conscious decision to listen. That means more often than not, it means having to put your phone away, out of sight, out of mind, really tune into the person 100%.
Shutting up.
Shut up. Like, don't actually say anything. Even if you know what you want to say, or you want to say something to identify with the person, don't do it. Don't interrupt. Let them get their story out there. If you're really experiencing that apprehension of like, oh God, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? We have some phrases and questions you can ask that we'll talk about in a second. But the main thing is try to squash that apprehension, that fear, and really use the energy instead to focus in on what they're telling you. And then at the end of whenever you think they might be done talking, wait 3 seconds in silence. Use that silent pause. It will give you a chance to metabolize what you just heard and to process it. It also gives them a chance to potentially tack on some extra information and maybe share something a little bit deeper that they've been hesitant to share with you. And then the moment comes where you do at some point have to do something and say something, most likely. And so what are some of the things you can ask and say? How are you doing today is a big one, because we know throughout a cancer journey, there are bad days, but not every day is the worst day ever. So you might be surprised. They might say, today was a particularly good day. I have my energy back. I reconnected with an old friend. But overall, it's tough, but today was a good one. And look, they just shared with you so much more than if you just said, how are you doing? And they go, I'm fine. You can also ask them, what has that been like for you? Specifically, like, what has your unique experience been? And they'll probably internally think, thank God someone's finally giving me the chance to share that. Because up until this point, everyone's just been assuming that they know what it means to have cancer because they had a family member with cancer. And now I can share my story and how I've reacted to the news and how I've managed uncertainties and whether my expectations of care and support have been met or not. And what do I need, and really personalize it. And then at the end of the day, that even though supporting someone is supposed to be a good thing, you can mess it up, but you now have the tools to hopefully not mess it up.
Yes. And the question, when it's really like the gift of curiosity, which is like the antithesis of making assumptions. And I think, like, even from your baseball metaphor that sort of run throughout the entire conversation, that's if you can approach it with the lens of being curious, I think you're setting yourself up to do better at the plate than you would be in most other situations. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely. And, just to extend it just a step further, is that, like, if you've ever followed baseball, if you get a hit 3 out of 10 times throughout your career, you're going to be a Hall of Fame player, like an all-time great. That's how difficult that sport is. And so realize that being a good communicator doesn't mean hitting a home run every time or even getting a hit every time. Like, realistically, if you're supporting someone on a daily basis or a weekly basis for a year or two, at some point along the way, you're going to say some dumb shit. You're just going to mess it up at some point. And that's okay. You can be honest with the person and ask for forgiveness and say, maybe I shouldn't have made that joke, or, I should have been more sensitive, or I think I could have phrased that better. Like, yeah, we're giving you tools for your toolkit here, but realize there's a learning curve. And at some point in time, whether it's in this situation or in your romantic relationships or as a parent, you're gonna mess it up, and that's okay. Like, don't freak out, manage it, and admit that you could have done something better, and then continue to be a great supporter.
Yeah, and sometimes at the beginning of an episode, you forget to call your friend a doctor. So,
That's fine.
Dr. Colter Ray.
Yeah, like I said, for pretty much my entire time as a doctor, all my friends remind me that if there's a medical emergency, that I still have to call 911. And I'm like, what? Yes. Come on, guys, give me some credit.
Yes. I've loved this conversation because I think it's the epitome of what I'm trying to do with Make It Mentionable, which is to make people feel less alone, and then also to increase self-awareness, because when we make it conscious, we can manage it. So if people want to connect with you, want to keep tabs on your research and what's going on, what is the best way for people to connect, or where can they find you?
Yeah, the advantage of having a weird name is that if you Google me, I will pop up pretty quickly. So Colter Ray, Colter is Colter, Ray is Ray. You can Google me, or colterray.com. That has a little bit more about me. I also publicly make all my research available. I just will continue to do that forever until a publisher actually threatens to take action, because I just don't like that my research wouldn't be available. So I just post all the PDFs. So you can just go on my website and click and download everything.
That is such a big deal. I know not everyone may realize how big of a deal that is, but I want to thank you for that, because having left academia and not having access to the papers, that is incredible. So thank you. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So anyone can click on them and download them and view them. And then also, and we didn't really get into this, but actually quite a few of the different tips and tricks we talked about today, the tools for the toolkit, were co-developed with Kelsey Crow, who is the founder of a great organization called Empathy Bootcamp, for which I am a trainer and a consultant. And so you can also find me through any of the work that Empathy Bootcamp does as well. If you're listening to this and you run an organization, or you're in an organization that needs better communication and better ways of showing up for each other and supporting each other and being a more empathetic person, definitely check out empathybootcamp.com. And you can also link over to that from my personal website as well. And
we will link it in the show notes too. So great. Thank you so much for being here. I loved this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you.
You've just finished listening to another episode of Make It Mentionable with me, your host, Alyssa Patmos. If you're looking for more in between episodes, then sign up for The Peel. It's my free newsletter that gives tips for how to navigate whatever life dishes. And it's also the place where I share the juiciest of stories. To check it out, head on over to alyssapatmos.com/The Peel. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.